If I knew there was going to be this many people here, I'd have made notes.
You don't need
Well, but David gave me kind of a choice. Could you hear me better if I stand up, or I'd rather sit down?
No.
All right. I think that's for the gentleman in the back corner there. They're hogging all the sound. He said you could talk about commercial fishing or anything else that interests you. Well, I'm tired of talking about commercial fishing. You know, I did it all my life, and it wasn't always the best job in the world. The romance goes out of it pretty quick when you the fall of the year. So I got thinking, what will I talk about? What else is there in Port Stanley besides buildings and people? So I decided I'd go with people. And from when I could remember, there were always older, single men in town, and I never knew where some of them come from or why they were, as a young kid, I figured I'd think some things out later on. But for those here that are familiar with Port Stanley, the last three that I would put in this class, they go on, they're here now. Well, it was George Loney. His father built the Loney house. And George had quite a storied and colorful career. He worked at ATT in the States for years. He was in 2 world wars. When I worked at the service station in the corner for 5 years, he would come over and entertain me at night with stories. And he did have some stories. But, and the other two are Joe McKenzie and Eric McKenzie. They lived in the family home right across from the bank by themselves for the most part. Eric worked for the county. And Joe was a commercial fisherman, and he worked the harvest in the prairies. They used to, what they call them? They sent a special train out there. Who's a railroad man? With help from the east to get the wheat off the prairies. Anyway, and then I started going through a list, which I'm going to, and nobody will know any of these people because most of them are dead and gone. But Don, interrupt me if you care to. The first one I thought about was old Bud Vaughn. You remember old Bud?
Oh, yeah.
He lived in a little cabin behind the bank building that's there now, between the bank building and the street. And it was not very big. 1 room. Don't ask me about bathrooms and things like that, but he was English, short. I don't think Bud could read because people sent him postcards from wherever they went. It was a thing to do, send old Bud a postcard. He got mail. He went to the mail every day. And I thought in later years, where did he come from? He must have had a family, but did you? No. Do you remember him?
Oh, yeah, I remember being in the room.
Yeah, and he lined the place with those postcards.
Covered.
Looked like shingles. And there was old Dave Comrie. He came from out around Port Stanley, or, around I think he was a hired man. Alfie York, Nels Walker, John Fulton Huff. He lived up on Main Street, the house just south of the ballpark on Main Street. And my mother told me a little story about John Fulton Huff, that he was an electrical engineer in New York City. And his mother got sick, so he come home to look after her. And when I was a kid, the curtains were falling off they had rotted right off. His mother had long since gone. And the only thing I ever remember him doing was working for the PUC, and at that time there was no backhoes, everything was dug. And that's what John Fulton Huff was doing. Pike Carey, he was on up the road a little farther. His wife had left him, Pearl. And I can remember peddling papers over there. And he sat in the kitchen always with a campaign hat. You know what a campaign hat is? Boy Scout hat. That's a campaign hat. And he was always having, rebolting for me at the time, tea and toast, loudly, very loudly. But he was a gentle little fellow. And then up on Catherine Street lived Andy Edgar, another old Englishman, wore the little glasses, always a shirt and tie, or suit and tie. And I was scared to go in there and collect for the paper. I delivered the Times Journal. I'd be 8 or 9. Because he kept everything in the house, the chickens, cats, dogs. The chickens roosted along the back of the Chesterfield and left whatever chickens leave behind the Chesterfield. And he was getting on into age, and I was pretty scared. Okay. Once in a while, my dad would come with me for support when I got so far behind I had to have money. And but he was an interesting old guy. And up on Lawrence Parker's farm at the top of Barbernell Hill. Everybody know where Barbernell Hill is in Port Stanley? Does anybody know where Barbernell is? At one time in history, if you said Barbernell Hill, everybody knew where it was. You go off the end of going west, you go off the end of Warren Street, across the Fingal Road, Barbernell Hill. Its counterpart on the other side, off of number 4 Highway, was Buckshot Hill. And remember Buckshot Hill? Yeah. And anyway, Alfie lived up there in a little cabin on Lawrence Parker's farm, and Lawrence grew sweet seed corn. And that was Alfie's job in the wintertime, to sit in there and sort the bad seeds of that corn by hand. They didn't have photo picker-uppers for those days. And coming back down Barbernell Hill on the right-hand side, these guys all had no close connections with anybody that I ever knew, was Eli Stanton. Another guy that I was a little bit leery of. Not that he was dangerous or anything, I was leery of most people. But he lived there. But this is what I'm trying to bring out, what I've talked about a dozen people. And I don't remember when they died. I'm sure they did, all of them. But, and there was a couple more that I can't bring up. I should have wrote things down. But there was fishermen that come in here. The Temples. One Pay Bill, and that's all I ever knew him by, and Sideways Bill. And One Pay went missing, and he was working on the Lindover, and it was tied up at the old dry dock above the bridge, and he didn't show up for work. There was nothing strange about that. And Dick Payne was fishing a few nets down the lake, and with a small open boat, and he just got around the end of the East Pier there, and there was One Pay. He'd been there a week or two, I guess. And his brother did the same thing. That would be Sideways. And he was fishing for Newt Sturgeon, who was the captain of the Cisco when she went aground in 1955 down at Clear Creek with the loss of a couple lives. But he didn't show up for work. 3 or 4 days he floated up in between the dock and the boat. And I never knew of them to have families or where they ate, if they did. And yeah, they were. So there's just a little of the remembrance of my childhood here and the people. There was older ladies. I can't name quite as many because they weren't quite as visible as these guys. But, oh, and we had 3 Boer War veterans here in Port Stanley. Billy Bolt was a Boer War veteran. Bill Snowden worked for the LMPS. He was a track, you know, he cleaned out the tracks and kept the landers full. And John Wiley, that lived over in the vicinity where the Legion was. There was a little house set in there, just north of Fauner Lumber Company's office. And I don't know where John worked. But Bill Bolt, there's still lots of Bolts around Port Stanley. And but they came here after the Boer War because, as near as I can tell, it was Great Britain's Vietnam. It wasn't very popular, ever. And things were tough when the Boer War was over. Boer War was over around the turn of the century. And they didn't want those guys back because there was no place for them. So they offered him passage to the colonies. And that's how those 3 guys ended up in Port Stanley. They got so much money and lived good, productive lives here. Another gentleman that I forgot was Harry Turner. And Harry, my dad always said he was a remittance man. I didn't know what the hell a remittance man was. But it's somebody in England that didn't fit in with the family, usually money people. I don't think Harry was like that. But he was he came here to help in a butcher shop right across. I can tell you who's lived there for the last 60 years, but I can't explain it to you. But it's a yellow store sits here, just south of the gray house on the corner of the hotel. And he was also the town constable at one time. And there's a few more, but the Bastine sisters, they lived with their sister. Billy's wife was Mary, and there was Florence and May, and their name was Bastine. So I don't imagine they came with Billy from Africa. But anyway, I'm getting tired. My voice is running out. And I don't know. I find stuff like that interesting.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Okay.